Today, the prime minister in Finland said she expects a decision to be made in her country about asking to join NATO, quote, within weeks, not within months. Her government presented its security review of the issue to their parliament today. Their parliament is expected to vote soon to make the NATO ask. I mean, bottom line here, if Putin started this war to try to push NATO back from Russia's borders, he is accomplishing exactly the opposite. He's going to have a lot more NATO on the borders when this is all over. Unless, of course, we decide to screw things up. The other NATO countries actually have to vote to allow any new members to join the alliance. Aaron Blake writes in the Washington Post today about the possibility that the country that is perhaps most likely to block that possibility might be us, because of our Senate and the Republicans within it. Quote, joining NATO isn't just a matter of Finland and Sweden deciding to become members. It is also about whether current members would agree to this. In the United States, that would require at least 2/3 of the U.S. Senate to vote to ratify their membership. Exactly how that debate would go down could be quite interesting, especially in light of the Republican Party's slight but significant Trump-era drift into more skepticism of NATO. And the looming unknown would be Trump himself weighing in on the process and not necessarily in favor. Mr. Blake points out, quote, that just last week, more than 30% of House Republicans voted against even a symbolic measure reaffirming support for NATO. I mean, on the one hand, it would be very unexpected for a NATO member like the U.S. to block new countries joining the alliance. On the other hand, given the parties involved and given the weird Trumpy feelings about Putin in the Republican Party now, maybe this is a real thing to worry about? Joining us now is Washington Post senior political reporter who wrote that piece for the Washington Post, Aaron Blake. Mr. Blake, it's nice to see you. Thank you for making time to be here tonight.
Thank you.
I have oversimplified this a little bit, I acknowledge. But let me just ask you to correct me if I've got any of the basic points wrong here. You're basically raising the prospect that because of internal Republican Party dynamics and ideological shifts within the Republican Party, particularly in the Trump era, they might not vote to let these two new countries join NATO.
Look, I think the conventional wisdom is that Republicans and Congress more broadly would sign off on this on a pretty bipartisan basis. But also remember, this is something that requires 2/3 majorities in the Senate. This has been a consensus issue in the past. In 2003, 2004, it was actually unanimous when there were 7 countries joining. In 1999, 98, it was an overwhelming vote, 80-19. But that was an interesting one because while it wound up being a very significant majority in favor, there were concerns about this being provocative to Russia, and those were bipartisan concerns. So I think if you overlay that on some of this shift away from NATO and away from foreign alliances in the Republican Party, you layer on top of that a president who has wrecked shop in NATO to some degree, has called into question that alliance, and according to his own advisors, considered pulling out of it in a second term. I think there really is a law of unintended consequences when it comes to how this might play out, even if that might not ultimately mean that this is in any real danger of failing in the U.S. Senate.
It was interesting, and I think it was important that you noted that just last week there was that vote, again, a symbolic resolution expressing support for NATO, where we had 30% of the House Republican caucus vote no on that, even though it wasn't binding, even though it wasn't going to actually effectuate anything in the real world, simply to show us effectively the spirit of the United States in supporting this alliance when it's under, as they stand united against the Russian invasion. Did you hear around that vote new arguments or new rationale from Republicans in terms of why they might not stand with NATO even for a vote like that?
Well, a lot of it, there weren't a whole lot of explanations that came out. You did see some of the more long-established NATO critics basically saying that they don't like the idea of being too beholden to this alliance. I think what struck me, though, from some of the other reactions that I saw from more rank and file members, Freedom Caucus types, was the idea that this commitment shouldn't be open-ended, that this should not be something where we should be unequivocal in our continued support for NATO. And so I think that's where we start to get into these issues of, if this really comes to a head, if you see the leader of the Republican Party not necessarily opposing Finland and Sweden joining the alliance, but maybe casting things in a more ambivalent way, like he has in the past when it comes to Ukraine joining NATO. In 2015, he was very non-committal about that. It really is a situation in which there is going to be pressure on some of these Republicans to toe that more NATO skeptical line. And it may not manifest itself as much in the Senate, where there's been some more independence of Trump from Senate Republicans. But I think the party as a whole would be forced into some kind of uncomfortable conversations if their leader isn't going to come on board and endorse this kind of thing. And I think that's very much an open question.
Yeah, if their leader isn't going to come on board, and if he's willing to not just be NATO skeptical, but to be pro-Putin in his analysis of it, as he has been in the past, hopefully there's a higher political cost for that now. But we'll know when we get there. Aaron Blake, senior political reporter for The Washington Post. Appreciate your analysis. Appreciate your time here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.